No.
Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle Moog, Executive Director of the Bob Moog Foundation and the Moogseum here in Asheville, North Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon as we take a deep dive into a very interesting part of Moog history. We are honored today to have former Moog engineer Jim Scott joining us. Jim started with R.A. Moog Co. in Trumansburg, New York in 1969. He worked on the Moog modular, the Minimoog, and when R.A. Moog Co. became Moog Music, he worked on the Micromoog, the Multimoog. He eventually left Moog Music, and in the early 80s went on to work with Bob Moog and Tom Ray on the Crumar Spirit. We'll be talking about his involvement in all of those synthesizers here today, and we are also honored to have Moog historian Brian Kehew here doing the interviewing. We are also very lucky. Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle Moog, executive to have him here with us. As you all know, Brian is highly accomplished in the music technology sector. He was one of the two members of the Moog Cookbook. He is one of the authors of Recording the Beatles. He is a lauded and respected Moog historian and has done tons of research. So we are lucky to have him here guiding this conversation. I want to thank Jim and Brian for being here, but I also want to thank one other person who you won't be seeing, but that is Tim Kennedy, who's our live stream coordinator. We're very lucky to have him donating his services here today. And actually, everyone here is are donating their time. And Tim, in particular, is doing that to help the Bob Moog Foundation out as we are still navigating the financial aftermath of Hurricane Helene. So, although this live stream is free of charge and we are happy to provide it, we encourage everybody to make a donation to the Bob Moog Foundation to help keep us strong and resilient as we continue to navigate the financial changes from the hurricane. So, without further ado, I am going to pass it over to Brian Kehew. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brian, and I'm very happy to welcome you
Historian
to
and has done tons of research, so we're
our
lucky to have
extended
you.
family. We have literally family, Michelle, a good friend as well, and Jim Scott, who is definitely a core member of the Moog development team. Jim is specifically an engineer, and those are some of my favorite kinds of people because they tend to be grounded and less ego and very creative people. And I find that very interesting and attractive and charming. It's cool. So we'll get Jim unmuted here so he can chat with us. I want to make sure we can get him on audio. Jim is unable to get a video signal today. He's up in Talkeetna, Alaska, which is quite a bit away from here, which is in cloudy Los Angeles today. And we are triangulating here.
No, Jim's on. Jim, can you hear?
And
I'm here. I can hear all this.
there he
Can you
is.
hear me
That's the man
clearly?
himself. Okay, great.
I've been listening to all this. I'm on speakerphone. If it gets unclear, let me know, and I'll pick up the phone.
It actually sounds quite good, Jim. So we'll start going with things. I want to talk to you as I'm very curious, actually, although we've spoken many times. What was your younger days like? How did you get involved in designing and electronics and things? What was that like for a kid?
Actually, I got into electronics when I was in the service in the U.S. Navy as a gunfire control technician. And then when I finished, when I got out of the service, I had gone to college, dropped out because I was fooling around and not being very serious. Got married, went in and out of the service. When I got out of the service, I went back to college to get an engineering degree.
Did you have any musical skills at all? I don't know of you playing an instrument. Do you have musical background?
I have a long history of listening to music, and the only musical instrument I could play very amateurishly was the recorder, the little flute. And I could play it musically so that people could think I was actually a musician if they didn't listen to me for too long. But I never had this facility. I never had a facility to read music except to.
But you mentioned being a music fan. Was there a point in time that you remember that electronics was an interest and then suddenly music and electronics joined together somehow?
Yeah, I was interested in musical instrument design long before I got into electronics. And then I went into electrical engineering as a way, and this was before Moog was heard of, because I thought electrical engineering background would be good be useful in designing musical instruments, whether they be acoustic or. And I was thinking actually of using the mathematical discipline of engineering for designing acoustic instruments. I wasn't thinking of synthesizers because they did not exist then.
That is cool. And then was there a day when the concept of a synthesizer became real for you?
Yeah, when the Switched on Bach album came out and I heard it on the radio, I was still in college. I was still going to engineering school in Berkeley in '69 when I first heard Switched on Bach, and that's got me. And as a result of that, I eventually got a hold of Moog and talked myself into a job.
Okay, let's jump in right there. We've got a picture of Bob to put up. That's our first slide for you all. And this is a picture of Bob right around the time you met him in 1969. I believe that was the year you guys met.
This is him. This is the photograph of him surrounded by modular equipment.
Exactly. That's the photograph of him
Okay,
at the
I've got the
MoMA
photograph
concert.
up.
So you guys met
Yeah.
before that event, though. You met by submitting something to him. You were asking for a job or just trying to find this man whose name was known?
Well, when I first heard the Switched On Bach album, I knew I wanted to work for Moog. I was still going to college. I still had another half year to finish up. And so I wrote him a letter, heard nothing for a long time. Finally, I got a call, I don't know, must have been July or something, that he was flying through San Francisco. Could I meet him at the airport the next day? This is a San Francisco Bay Area. So I met him at the airport, and he invited me to go to the audio engineering society convention in Los Angeles a few weeks after that, where I first got my hands on synthesizers, saw and talked myself into a job.
I like the story of that. When you visited Los Angeles a few years ago, we took you over to that same hotel and stood in the lobby and looked up at the room where you saw your first synthesizer in person. But you said that Bob was very busy that day, so you ended up doing some work with him?
Well, yeah, it's a Roosevelt Hotel, I think it was. And there was a lot of publicity. Everybody was after Moog. Everybody wanted to talk to Moog. There were curious people and customers and the press and people trying to interview him. And so he was constantly talking to people all day long. And this was in a hotel room. I think he was sleeping in the room at night, and it set up as a demonstration with several pieces of his equipment there. A couple of synthesizers and a Moog MRS tape recorder. And so I listened to his first demo, and then he was busy talking to people. And, he's an engineer with a musical background and so forth. And I got it right off the bat when he went through it the first time, how it worked. So I ended up for most of the rest of the day explaining to people how this thing worked while Bob was over on the other side of the room talking to somebody else about something else.
I think that is fantastic because
I gave his demo all day for half a day at least.
I love the story because you just seen your first synthesizer and moments later you're demonstrating it to people, which is a pretty big leap for some people. But because of your engineering background, I'm sure oscillators and filters and amplifiers made sense, whereas a lot of people, all of that was new language.
Yeah, it's an audio file, with good audio equipment and so forth.
And it's a pretty sensible system, the way it was laid out in those days. It's pretty sensible, building blocks of sound. And then that day was the day you finally talked to Bob about working for him, right?
Yeah, I got the feeling during that day that maybe Bob was trying to avoid me. I think he wanted to tell me that, sorry, he couldn't give me a job. But finally, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we went out of the hotel, sat out on a balcony and overlooked the dining room. And we sat side by side on a couch that was sitting out there, both of us staring out into the space, neither one of us knowing what to say. So we just sat there for a moment, trying to figure out something to say. And finally he said, how about 8,000 a year? And I said, yes. And that was it. That was the whole summer.
Well, you've spent a good portion of your life with, yeah.
And that was a time when an engineer right out of college was getting about 10,000. So it was kind of a lowball offer, but I was not taking no for an answer. So I took it.
This was the time, and again, you're just meeting Bob, getting to know him, but you spent many years of your life with him. Bob was not a busy talker a lot of times. He was more of a thinker and a little bit quiet, even shy at times, especially back then. As far as he was certainly not a loudmouth. Let's put it the opposite of that, whatever that is. And so I can see that moment happening.
And also, our wives knew one another socially. There's a social group in Keaton and Moog and I and others were part of that. Bunch of people. It was a very conservative town, and we were non-conservative people in a very conservative village, bedroom village.
So that is our next step, is you're going from the West Coast all the way to upstate New York, the town called Trumansburg, which is like a little village, really.
Yeah, yeah. It's surrounded by farms, that sort of thing, and about
Yeah.
15 miles from Ithaca, New York.
Yeah, I think it's a big main city and certainly a hub of a lot of things. But at the time, this was the village where Bob took his family, and you had a family to move as well, too, right?
Yes, yeah. I have a wife and 2 kids.
And when you were there, what did it seem like? This new company, what state were they in as far as activity or health of the company and the people? What did you think of all this new stuff?
Well, it was very creative, very busy atmosphere. An awful lot of projects going on, and so I was given some responsibilities, and I plunged into it. The first project was actually around a programmable preset synthesizer that was Bob's modular equipment, modified with some conveniences to allow it for live performance. It was the equipment that was first developed for the famous concert at the Garden in August of '69. And that concert happened a few weeks before I got to Trumansburg and started working. And then Bob had hopes that we could sell equipment to make modular equipment playable on stage, and so that was demonstrated at the so-called concert at the Garden at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and then there was an attempt to put that kind of equipment in production, and what came out of it was the couple of things. One was Gershon Kingsley's first Moog quartet, with four modular synthesizers with push button preset arrangement, so they could be played live with some facility. And also, one of the instruments that was built for that concert in August of '69 ended up as the basis for Keith Emerson's Monster Moog. He bought one of those systems and then expanded over the years.
The Gershon Kingsley Quartet did tour the country and get good reviews and things. They were taking that idea from the MoMA concert live out across the country, but it was really Keith Emerson that took the idea of a modular synthesizer live. Was trouble unless you had one of these custom-made preset boxes.
Yeah, we made 4 systems for the MoMA. I wasn't there when it was with Bob Moog and Bill Hemseth and Chad Hunt. But they built 4 systems for that concert, of which 3 of them were eventually cannibalized, since they're modular. And one of them ended up being sold, and that's the one that went to Keith Emerson.
It's a pretty healthy success, even in that one sale. And of course, he was the next person after Wendy Carlos to put the Moog on the map. But at that point, Moog was healthy. They had ridden on, switched on Bach 1968 late, and then into 1969. The company was at its most healthy as R.A. Moog. But then things started changing, didn't they?
By the time I got there in September of '69, other than fulfilling a backlog, I suppose, sales had tanked. We pretty much saturated the market with all the people that had $10,000 or $15,000 to plunk down for a synthesizer. So we were, as I began to work there in 1970, we were getting in more and more into trouble. Bob was seriously in debt. The company and Bob Moog personally was seriously in debt when I worked there in 1970.
If
so
we
the
can bump over
Minimoog
to
was an idea.
The next
Yeah, go
slide
ahead.
will show you that factory in Trumansburg where you all were working.
And that was the former Baldwin's furniture store.
Yeah, if
And,
it wasn't for the signage, you would not recognize it as a state-of-the-art, world-class synthesizer factory. But it was in this middle of a kind of a about 2 blocks makes up the whole downtown of Trumansburg.
yeah, several blocks long, and that's in the middle of a block of several stores. Next door to us is Kostrom's Diner. I think you can see. I think that large window off to the right is actually. I'm not quite sure anymore. Right next door to us was a diner.
And your factory also had the upstairs rooms too, which comes into play next because upstairs there was a lot of leftover parts. There was an attic with leftover bits, right?
Yeah, if you look at that photograph, there's like several windows above the entrance, and
Yeah.
behind those windows is actually an attic that was full of all the cast-off, broken cast-off prototypes. You know, just keep it around. We might have a use for it someday. Kind of stuff piled up in there.
And so what happened with those cast-off pieces?
Well, occasionally we'd go up there and sometimes we would cannibalize something or and that sort of thing. And that's how the Minimoog got started. Is that Bill Hemsath went up there and grabbed discarded parts and assembled the A model Minimoog. Most of the A model was out of stuff out of that. We called it the dungeon, although actually it was an attic, storage attic. And right behind that storage attic was the engineering department, right on the back side of the building.
And we have another slide that shows 4 Minimoog prototypes, courtesy of EMIAP, who have them now in that wonderful place in Harleysville, Pennsylvania. And then this is courtesy of the book, which is Tom Ray's Electronic Perspective we spoke about on the last podcast. Fantastic book. If anybody doesn't have it, it is the history of 20th century electronic instruments. So these pictures are from there, and I see on the top left the Min Model A. So they used to call it what? The Min A and the Min B were the official names of the first two.
No, that's what Hemsath, he wanted to call it the Min, not the Mini. So he had a contest of wills with John Huszar, who was our business manager, and John Huszar, and everybody else wanted to call it the Mini too. But Hemsath, to this day, if he's still alive, always referred to it as the Min. And the first 2 synthesizers that we produced, the A model, only one was made. That was Hemsath's Swiss Navy project. He did that on his own time, on his own initiative, without saying much of anything to anybody about it. He just built one. So that A model was built. That A model for a long time was used by Dave Borden of a group called Mother Mallard's Portable Masterpiece Company. One of the musicians who had access to the studio in Trumansburg. He had a full electronic music studio at that facility in Trumansburg.
Dave Borden is a wonderful guy, and I encourage people to look up Mother Mallard's Portable Masterpiece Company was their full name. And it is really beautiful music based upon minimalism, but a lot of complex hand-played performance pieces with layered synthesizers. And that Min A was used on quite a few of their tours and recordings that they made, as well as the regular Moog modulars too. And then what's the change when there's a B model?
Okay, right next to it, to the right is the B model. Is the B model. We built 2 of those, and that was, we called it at the time the integrated synthesizer, because the A model is actually made out of actual Moog modules lashed together and wired together in the back, and the B model still used Bob Moog circuit boards, but it had a one-piece front panel in front of all the electronics. So, and 2 of those were built. There's EMF has one that survived, which was for a while in the 70s, being performed by Dick Hyman, how he pronounces his name. And the other one was in the hands of Sun Ra, which was eventually lost on a pawn shop fire. That's the only B model that exists of the 2 that were built.
And then down below, we see the
Uh,
thing called the Model C, which is where really it became some kind of program, right? A concentrated effort to,
the C model has all new circuit design, and all the circuit boards, all the circuitry inside was redesigned by Moog, myself, and Hemsat, designed and hand built 4 of those things, or at least we hand built one in the production department, copied them. Anyway, we made 4 so-called C models. They were very, very nearly. The D model is basically the C model that was engineered for production, and as the circuits are put on actual printed circuit boards instead of being hand wired. So the B and the C are very similar, and so you're looking at a C model on the lower left. 4 were built. That's the only one known to exist now. One was given to me and then eventually lost in a fire. One was converted partially to a D model for Chris Swanson, and the 4th one is missing in action. I don't think anybody knows what happened to it.
yeah.
So you're looking at the photograph, the only known C model, and right next to it is a hybrid machine. It's part C, part D. It's one of the C models from the waist down, but the upper works, the black part, is from a production D model from about mid-1970. That was Chris Swanson's machine, which he used for a number of years for a lot of live performances.
Chris Swanson Chris is an important name in the Moog history, although he may not be known to many, many people, but he was working at the factory as kind of composer in residence.
Yes, that's pretty accurate. So,
and he had serious training, especially in the big band world and doing arranging, but I noticed that there's a big ribbon on the front of his prototype CED model there. That's something specific to the way Chris used to play instruments, right?
Yes. He was a brass player, and so he was used to always working to stay on pitch. He had a perfect pitch. So the fact that that synthesizer the early Minimoogs didn't stay on tune very well, didn't matter very much to him, because he always had that finger, his free hand on that ribbon, adjusting a pitch to stay right in tune with the band. So it never bothered him very much that the early Minimoogs were not perfect as far as pitch stability. So that has a custom ribbon control.
Go ahead.
So Bob put a custom ribbon controller on Chris's machine, which you can see in the photograph.
I think it's very important to note that Chris and his control of pitch, which wasn't very common on a Hammond organ or a Fender Rhodes or any previous keyboards, pitch control was never considered very important, but to a horn player or a singer or a violinist, pitch control is a very important expression. And so Moog's innovation of left-hand controllers is very much driven by the fact that everyone was used to Chris bending and pulling notes around. So we start to see that with the Model C there, specifically on the left side, out of the way of the keyboard, but usable by your left hand if your right hand is playing the keyboard. It's pretty common now, of course.
Yeah, actually, Chris didn't use those knobs on the left-hand controller for modulation injection. We're not quite sure exactly how he used them, and neither is one of the members of Chris's band. When I asked him, he wasn't quite sure how Chris was using those sliders.
No, but I think that what we're saying is that the concept of pitch control as a live performer is driven by Chris and his use of that. It's not that he used those controls and that was not his way. He preferred the ribbons always, which becomes later important with some of your other instruments. But in this case, the Minimoog is the first synthesizer. Even the Moog modulars and the early ARPs did not have left-hand controls for performers, which is very common now.
Yeah, if you look at the A model up in the upper left, you can see a slide pot on the left end of the keyboard.
Yeah.
That was a pitch bender. And on the B model next door, there's actually a slider on the front panel that goes left and right, which it turned out to be awkward. And so on the C model, we put the pitch controller back over on the left side along with the modulation injector. So on the C model, those two knobs that slide up and down are injecting modulation and bending pitch. And then Chris's custom machine, he actually did not use those knobs for pitch control. He used the ribbon.
I know the design of the Minimoog is an iconic instrument. It is kind of, in some ways, as Tom Ray calls it, the archetype of a synthesizer. The Prophet 5 and the Oberheims and everything else are based upon the simple ideas of a Minimoog with, usually one filter, simple ADSR controls type things. When you were making the Minimoog, I was always curious what changed between the Moog modular filter or oscillators, for example. Did you guys just adapt what was there, or did you find ways to improve it?
What we're trying to do is simplify, to get the cost down, simplify and fob circuitry. So a lot of the circuitry in the Minimoog is based on Moog's modular circuits, but adapted. And the voltage control filter, voltage controlled amplifier, contour generators, and so forth. I did the detailed design for those, and I based them on Moog's original modular stuff. And I removed a lot of circuitry that wouldn't be needed in a small live performance machine. For example, but the most important removal was I simplified the voltage controlled amplifier, the VCA, by taking out components that the original voltage controlled amplifier, the modular one, had in place to reduce distortion. And I took all those parts out, figuring, well, we'll just let it distort, see what it sounds like. And if it's okay, we'll just leave those parts out because they aren't needed in a live performance machine. Because the 902, the original voltage controlled amplifier, processed both DC and AC. You could process control voltages in it as well as audio. So, whereas in the Minimoog, all you're doing is audio. So I said, okay, just for the heck of it, I'll leave all those resistors out that were designed to prevent distortion, and just let it distort and see if it sounds okay. And from my ear, after I did that, it sounded okay. I couldn't tell that it had any.
It seems like the design team.
Harmful effect.
Yeah.
But immediately after the very first C model was built, Hemseth immediately recognized that it sounded the sound quality that we got out of it. So we didn't know quite where it was coming from, the VCF or the VCA at the time, because they were both very heavily overdriven deliberately to get the signal to noise ratio as clean as possible. And Hemseth, upon hearing it, said, Scott overdrove the VCF and the VCA by about 10 or 15 dB, and whatever you do, don't, I'm mimicking his tone of voice, don't change it. So it turned out to be the, years later, the secret sauce turned out to be overdriving the distorting VCA was the real secret sauce to the Minimoog sound. Speaking
of secrets, you have pointed out to me something that I didn't know, and I think it's most people are unaware that there's actually 2 VCAs in each Minimoog.
Yeah, it's pretty hidden from sight, but I put in my first VCA to do the enveloping. They attack the case the same, release the loudness of the note as a progression time. Then I put in a second VCA after it connected to what was supposed to be a foot pedal input. that I don't think anybody ever used. But there were two VCAs in series, and both of them were contributing distortion. And so the fact that there was a second VCA in there after the first, and both are heavily distorting, but the distorting was livening up the sound. The sound of an oscillator and the synthesizer is pretty boring. It's just a boo. Yeah, you got it. So a lot of the design of adding filters and contouring and so forth was to make that, and ring modulation and all those other things, was to make the sound more interesting to the ear. So it turned out adding,
Yep.
Yeah. And
Sorry,
so,
we just have a little time lag, so sometimes we speak over each other, but it's okay to do that. I was just mentioning that you put these rear jacks on the back, making it minimally controllable by control voltages, one for filter, one for pitch, and one for VCA. As you mentioned, that's the additional VCA control. But I really think if people haven't played with it, put a CV pedal into the filter alone, and playing your Minimoog will be 100 times more fun. I think it was Steve Picaro who pointed out many years later that people are ignoring these amazing control options by having, you can run a drum machine and control the pitch in some weird ways. It'll bounce around. You can do all these cool things with external triggers. Now we're pretty familiar with that language of modularity, but back then, almost none of the Minimoog players utilized those jacks, which was a real shame.
well, part of the reason was there was a pedal, a dual pedal that was supposed to be a product that never really made it. In the transition, the company was moved from Trumansburg to Williamsville, New York, in late '71, and the prototype pedal didn't survive this move, but it was two pedals and everything else that was ready. They would just plug right in. Chris Swanson had one of those dual pedals. In fact, it's at EMEAP next with that C/D hybrid that we saw in the previous in the lower right. That machine has a pair of foot pedals dedicated to it, which are still offerable.
And the foot pedals were controlling the glide on and off, and they were controlling the decay release function on and off, which is kind of interesting performance idea. Those who had found one, and there's a few that made it into a catalog, but it uses a little smaller jacks that plug into that left side cheek block. Not visible on any of these pictures we're showing, but definitely was an interesting idea. But again, people use the synthesizer as it sat on the table mostly, rather than using all these cool options. Now, in your opinion,
Bob's idea was to make it performance oriented, and the performer could get his hands, feet, mouth, and everything else as much as he could into controlling the sound of the instrument. Because he was a musician, he was trained as a pianist, so he could think both as an engineer and as a musician, which was one of his strengths.
There's a new recent book which I'm holding up at the moment, which is the Minimoog book, Joe Silva's book, and I recommend most people because you get very deep in the weeds with your explanations and discovery. We're both mentioned in this book. In fact, almost everybody I've ever met is in this book somewhere. There's a lot of great musicians and technicians and so forth who are interviewed for the book. And there's tons of documentation and photos and things like that. We could spend all day on the Minimoog, but we have so much more to talk about with you. But before we move on, what is it that made the Minimoog so special to people?
I suppose, some of it's just mystique. It's Bob Moog's instrument, and but a lot of it is the sound quality, and a lot of it is, as a matter of fact, the accidental contribution of the voltage controlled amplifier design, which was nailed down with later research. And experience that VCA was critical. The VCA at one time was modified for a short period of time, when the Trump company moved to Williamsville, it was decided to remove the distortion, because all engineers knew the distortion was bad. And very ill-advised change was made to remove the distortion from the Minimoog. And immediately there were a lot of complaints from everybody that something happened. The Minimoog didn't sound like the Minimoog anymore. So they had to put the distortion right back in.
I remember talking to Bob once many years ago, and I mentioned that what I liked about the Minimoog was no matter how you set it, it always made pleasant sounds. Even if they were clangorous and weird, it was still beautiful sounding or rich sounding or interesting. It didn't have really an ugly side to it. But most people played it very musically and simple. And I told him I really liked the simplicity of it, that it was very easy to work. And he mentioned at the time, no, they told him that musicians didn't like complications. And the keyboard players were very simple people with a piano or maybe a Fender Rhodes, that they could not understand technology. The keyboard players were anti-technology, and he had trouble selling the Minimoog. So I think that's one of those things that over time we've grown to appreciate it as a very powerful set of features. You've mentioned a couple times a place called Williamsville, and I believe we have another slide coming up. This is a next generation factory, 1971 into 72. Williamsville is a subset of Buffalo, and Buffalo is to the west. How far from Trumansburg?
About half a day's drive.
Yeah, it's not close.
Because he's driving back and forth a lot.
Most people I know think of New York as being Manhattan. They think of New York City, but they don't realize the massive amounts of beautiful spaces. And upstate New York is just this huge, almost a multi-state sized territory. But when the factory was moved, it was bought out by a new owner. Moog Music was bought.
That's right. And that's an early photograph of the building. It had been modernized by late, I guess it was 73 when I went back to work for the company. That garage to the left was converted into the shop with all the machine shop, and that muddy driveway.
Can you compare the places now? Trumansburg is this beautiful kind of woodsy area, a village, if you will, and then a suburb of Buffalo, which is a massive town, but a lot more concrete and things like that. Even Williamsville is a suburb of all that. But basically, it was Bob and his family were the only ones initially to come out from Trumansburg. Everyone else did not really decide to go with him.
Yeah, what's his? I forgot his first name. Updike, the service manager, went with
Raymond
the company
Updike.
in Moog, and that
Ray
was
Updike.
Ray Updike went, and later on, after a couple of years, David Luce and Tom Ray recruited me to come back to work for the company.
Yes, so we have the next picture, which is the man you just mentioned, Tom Ray, is our next photograph. And he is here in the cinder block building. So if you see cinder blocks, that's always the Moog Williamsville factory. And so at that point, the Minimoog had gone into very beginnings of production, and then the company moved. So what changes were happening in the company at that time?
I'm sorry, my mind was wandering someplace else. Ask that again.
Well, just when you went to Williamsville, it's a new owner. Where was he shifting the focus? What was he trying to do? And some of that is in the picture with the Sonic 6 and things like that.
Yeah, well, Waitena and Moog Musonics, or it was Musonics Incorporated at the time, was under the umbrella of a parent company called Venture Technology. And Venture Technology normally bought up small companies and put them on their feet and then sold them for profit. The only time that the Venture Technology, which is owned by Waitena, the only time it ever started their own company was Musonics, which developed the synthesizer that Tom has his hand on there, on Tom's Tom's
Tom's
right.
right. Yeah.
That's a Sonic 6, and the Sonic was designed by the Musonics company and put into production by the time. And then when Venture Technology bought Moog, they ended up merging the two companies. So now they got two synthesizers, the Minimoog and the Sonic you see in the photograph. They're both in production. The idea was to take the Minimoog out of production because it was not. The Minimoog was really a glorified prototype. It wasn't supposed to be the production model. And the Sonic 5, designed by Musonics, was designed for production. It has a lot of nice features and some faults too. So the intention was for the Sonic 6 there to be the mainstay of the company and to phase out the Minimoog. But as it turned out, the Minimoog sold and the Sonic didn't. So the Sonic eventually faded out. And,
Yeah, I realize on the
the
right-hand side of the Sonic 6, you've got a speaker built in, so you don't need an external amplifier. And it has a closing case, so you can put it away in a closet, mainly intended for classroom use in a lot of cases, because they thought the schools have a budget that individuals might not have, but they also have, 40,000 middle and secondary schools in America that might want to buy these as teaching instruments. And it never really did take off as a teaching instrument.
No, that's the Sonic 6. The Sonic 5 originally was a fixed wooden case, more similar to the Minimoog, and that didn't sell to musicians, so they repackaged it into a suitcase. Tom Ray referred to it as a Samsonite synthesizer that he was charged with selling, and he sold quite a few of them. Tom did. And the Sonic 6, as you see it there, was put into a suitcase, and then the circuitry was redesigned somewhat. The original filter in the Sonic 5 and the early Sonic 6s was designed with a filter other than Moog's ladder filter. And then the later versions of that Sonic were designed with a Moog ladder filter in it. And so
I have some questions coming in from people on the side who wanted to ask about things like those small jacks, which were used on the dual pedal. That's the left-hand cheek block on the Minimoog. Those are 3/8-inch jacks so that people don't accidentally plug in their guitar cable to it. It's designed in a strange way. Those jacks are made just for the switches on the Minimoog. Somebody's asking about that. And then
so if people didn't plug the normal patch cords with carrying audio and control voltages into those jacks, those jacks were not for audio or were not for control voltages. They're for specialized attachments that were it was electrically the circuitry that it was feeding was electrically incompatible with everything else. So I put in a 3/8 jack there to prevent people from plugging the wrong stuff in there. And the Moog was then supplied the switches with the right jacks for a while, but then they took them out of production. And then after that, nobody knew where to get those 3/8 jacks because that was my fault. Everybody knew where a Radio Shack was, and you can go get a jack like that. In fact, nobody in the industry knew where the heck to get those jacks to make their own switches and so forth.
So people are asking many questions that are far ahead of what we're talking about, but we will get to them eventually. But as you mentioned with those jacks, if somebody wants to do it, you can just change out the jacks, make a little larger hole and put a 1/4 inch there and use any standard foot switch that will open and close the circuit. You will have a functional pedal there. So that's good too. And then as we talk about you and Williamsville, we're showing Tom.
Prevent screw-ups. Go into an electronics catalog and get a 308, a 3/8 jack for connection, and there would be less.
Just difficult to find for
50.
normal people. But we've got Tom on the screen. I want to jump to the next slide, which shows Tom had written one of his great functions for Moog was to write a sensible user's manual. And a lot of this ties into what we're going to talk about later with the Spirit, because Tom had a different kind of approach than an engineer would have. Tom is a musician, well trained and very well versed in not only the history of instruments and how they function, but also in how to explain that to the layperson. So writing manuals, which, as you say, Tom Ray, PhD on there, he wrote many of the manuals that we still use for Moog music instruments. And then
He
we have
had a
another slide.
PhD in music education. So
Yes.
Yeah,
And the next slide is a person named Dave Luce, who we should mention certainly in this period was important.
Yes.
Dave was a brilliant engineer, and he dates from the time of Bob. They were both presenting at AES their instruments in 1964. So those guys go way back. But at the time, you were not working for Moog Music in Williamsville initially, that they came out to get you and kind of headhunted you back into the company.
Tom Ray and Dave Luce came in and hired me back. Yeah.
What were you doing in the meanwhile?
I was working for a national cash register company, working on coin dispensers and so forth.
When you came back, I want to mention this project because it's very core to you. You created your own even smaller than Mini is Micro, and the Micromoog was your project. If you'll tell us a bit about that one.
Yeah. I had an idea of a much smaller, simpler, cheaper machine as an entry-level machine for musicians. A single oscillator machine, and so pretty much I conceived of the idea, designed it, built the prototypes, and then shepherded it
Yeah.
into production. So I was pretty much the guy with that machine.
One
Pretty
of the
much
things
a one-man project.
One of the things that's special to Moog instruments, and people have been asking about this a bit, is the glide function, sometimes called portamento by some other synthesizers. But when you're gliding between notes, if I go from a low G to a high G, if I pull the key off on the high G before it reaches the final pitch, it doesn't continue gliding up. The gating of the key stops the circuit from gliding further, even if there's a long decay. Is that a specific choice made?
That's the way that Moog designed his original modular equipment in the mid '60s. And when I designed that circuitry into the Minimoog and into the Micromoog, I simply copied what Bob had done before. A lot of what we did was based on the modular equipment. It's very simplified versions of the modulars. So I retained a lot from the Moog's original, like, for example, the contours for the contour generators, the shape of the contour. I retained from the original contour generator from 1965 or whatever Bob decided.
Yeah.
And I always kept that, the actual shape, and also I kept the very fast attack capability of those instruments. So I kept the functionality of the modular equipment as I adapted the modular circuits to the Micromoog and to the Minimoog.
It's interesting because choices like that, the envelope shape, which users can only adjust the time of it, but the shape of it and the speed of it really gives an instrument character. And so does this glide. If you think about Moog glide, it tends to be a certain style of thing. Same way the filter we're very familiar with, the ladder filter, 24 dB per octave type of thing, gives them a familial kind of content where they sound similar to each other or even respond similar in some ways. So the Micromoog, I'm looking at the picture of Dave Luce, and you see that ribbon on the left side. Tell us about that choice.
Let me look at that.
Well, just the Micromoog has a ribbon instead of a pitch bend wheel, which was very popular, the wheel on the Minimoog.
Oh, okay. I'm in the wrong place here.
Just thinking about the Micromoog and the ribbon on it, I really love the ribbons.
The ribbon gives you an immediate return to center. You take your finger off and the pitch immediately jumps back to on pitch. So the pitch bends up or down. The exact center of the ribbon is, if you push there, the pitch doesn't change. And as you slide up, the pitch rises, and as you slide down, the pitch drops. Tom was very much like that feature for performance. Because you could just take your hand off those hand controller, the pitch jump right back instead of having to run a wheel back to get it back on pitch.
I'm a big fan of it too, and there was even a kit later on for Minimoogs that Moog made officially, where you could replace the left cheek block with a new mod wheel, but instead of a pitch bend wheel, it would have a ribbon for the Minimoog, and I love that. You could also play trills, which you could never do with a wheel. So it had most of the functionality of a wheel, but a few extra features, like you mentioned there too. So the Micromoog is an interesting thing. Yeah. Go ahead.
Largely at the emphasis of Tom Ray, who wanted that feature.
It's very cool. And then one of the things about the Micro is that it has one oscillator. Was that a real challenge to work with?
No, it's just a simplification. We're just trying to get a very low-cost machine that entry level performer without too much money or maybe not too many skills could play. And so we just kind of we designed it as I conceived of it as a one oscillator machine because I thought there was a market for it.
And we should talk about teamwork, because you are not an industrial designer who does packaging and shapes and things like that. Molded plastic thing. Tell us about teamwork making a synthesizer like this.
Well, Tony Marchese was our chief engineer when we were the company was in the Buffalo area. I was offered that position of chief engineer, and I turned it down. I did not want to be chief engineer. I was very happy as a project leader, and that was as far as I wanted to go. And so Tony Marchese was actually managing the engineering department, but he was a mechanical engineer, and he's the one that came up with the features of the case. That case is very rugged and has you can turn it upside down and stand on the thing. And Tom Ray used to do that as a stunt when he was giving demo. He'd be giving a talk, standing on a inverted Minimoog, and then reveal to the audience that not only did we stand behind our instruments, we stood on them, and then he would pull out the Minimoog and start playing it, or the Micromoog, I mean, and start playing it.
Our next picture is of you with your creation, the new Micromoog product, 1975 circa, with the matching hair and mustache from those days. And it's a great instrument, really does sound quite good. So you were maintaining these ideas of distortion capabilities and things like that?
Well, of course, we retained all that. It's just a kind of a shrunk, it's a shrunken down Minimoog. Which is why we came up with the name Micromoog.
And I think you had an innovation there because previously you'd had all these issues with drift and tuning. So can you tell us about the oscillator stability?
Oh, yeah. By the time we got to that instrument, it was an instrument with a very stable oscillator. Basically, the key component in a synthesizer oscillator is and this is analog circuitry. Is it coming up with an analog circuit that doesn't drift with temperature? And the key component is the so-called exponentiator. It's the part of the instrument that produces the equally tempered scale. And in the Micromoog, I designed it so that the key circuit that produced the equally tempered scale, musical scale, was thermostated. It actually had it. I used a transistor array, so I could use a transistor in the array as a thermometer and another one as a heater, and so that chip ran at a constant temperature despite the ambient temperature, which could be all over the place. So I designed it so as long as it inside the instrument stayed below 55 degrees centigrade, which is pretty hot, it would stay in tune, and it was extremely stable.
I think that was a nice thing to explain to people from the outside, is that you've got a package with a few transistors already built in, ready to use, and you can use them however you want based on the external circuitry around that. So you're creating an exponentiator to do the volts per octave kind of thing that you need to hear for an analog oscillator. And then you used another one as the heater circuit to actually raise the temperature above the room temperature. So no matter what the room was doing, the oscillator stayed very stable.
It's that worked extremely well. I don't know what I did right. Robert Moog developed a synthesizer called the Lyra, of which only one was ever built. It was part of what's called the constellation of several instruments: the polyphonic synthesizer, the Taurus bass pedal, and Lyra, which is supposed to be a replacement for the Minimoog. And I think only one Lyra was ever built, and I think it's still someplace on the planet being used by somebody, or in a museum or something. He and John Beers tried to do the same sort of thing, making a stable, heat stabilized exponentiator, and it didn't work. And mine worked, and I was never quite sure why mine worked and theirs didn't. But I worked independently, and then discovered they had done that, and tried it and failed, and I tried it and it was working. So we're not, like I say, we're not quite too sure exactly why that happened.
We're going to step through
So anyway,
slowly. If you want to go, I'm just going to have Tim step through a couple more pictures slowly. We've got about 4 in a row, just showing the Micromoog and its design. It's a beautiful 70s package, and it looked a little bit more modern than the woodsy version of the Minimoog, and it ended up being a bit more sturdy. But one of the cool things was that the keys did not stick out at all. They were protected against damage just by the packaging alone.
Yeah, and it was also designed for ease of maintenance. As you could open it up and have access to everything without all the cables for long enough for you could take it apart and service it while running and while disassembled. And also, I had designed it so that it was very easy to keep for the musician to keep tuned up. Any trim pots that musicians had any business turning were available on the back panel. I don't think that shows in any of these photographs. And and any adjustments they should keep their hands off were inside, and you had to take the machine apart to get your hands on them. And then I designed a whole circuitry and everything so that a musician could tune it by ear without instruments for range and scale and so forth, tweak it out.
Yeah. And I noticed
and
that
it was also designed. It also was designed to balance on its nose. So if you tip that synthesizer forward, it will balance on its nose. So you have access to the control panel, and if you look over, and now the back panel will be up, right?
Yes.
And as you peer over the front panel to the back panel, you see all the labels are on their upside down, so they read right side up when you're actually adjusting it.
Yeah, that's smart, because you're rarely standing behind it while you're working. You're usually looking over the top, so you printed everything upside down. Smart. Yeah,
on the back. Yeah, because the keys and the controls and everything are on the front. You're manipulating those while you're going through the process. And,
now, I'm noticing when you look at a Micromoog, there's this series of white switch caps to select certain functions, but they are literally caps that are just placed over a simple switch that slides left and right. Those are less expensive switches, though, than the Minimoog, right?
I suppose that's true, yeah.
Yeah, and uncommon to find, but also putting a switch cap on makes it easier for a musician on a dark stage to find what they're doing and to reach over in a hurry and grab something. You don't want little toggles and little micro switches to mess around with, even if they're not so expensive to make. Putting things like this is great industrial design, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose that may be accredited to either Tom Ray or Tony Marchese or both. Yeah.
You have another slide here, which is going to go forward to the manual. It is the Micromoog by Tom Ray, and the very next slide is the successor, the Multimoog. Can you tell us about that version of the project?
Yeah, we decided to do a 2-oscillator version of the Micromoog, and our parent company, Norland or whatever they called themselves, at that time the Moog company had been sold to the Norland operation. They insisted it was going to be called a Multimoog, which we at the Moog company thought was a pretty stupid name, but they insisted on it. It really should be called something like the Micromoog XL or something extra long, because it had an extra octave and 2 oscillators, and it was an extra octave. And I think it had some tests. I wasn't too heavily involved in developing the Multimoog, but I think it had a touch-sensitive keyboard of some sort. And I think I was leaving the company around the time that was going into production.
Yeah, and
So,
just before you left, I mean, we have another slide here showing the technical service manual, which is for both keyboards because they are related circuitries. And the Multimoog has some cool features. Rock Werman is asking
the
us
Multimoog
about...
the Multimoog has a full Micromoog circuit board and then an auxiliary circuit board for the additional circuitry.
Yeah, that makes production a lot more sensible too. Rock Werman was asking about the glide function because there are options for logarithmic, which is what it has, or linear glide function. And later on, that was a switchable thing on the project they called the Memory-Moog in the 80s. But did you ever play around with different glide functions or just stay with what Moog had used?
We just stayed with the logarithmic or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
Where it would coast up and slow down and finally get on pitch. The linear glide had some musical drawbacks, which Tom Ray will expound on at length.
Yeah, and for just 1 minute, because it's not that important, but you started a project that was actually called the Memory-Moog, but it's not the Memory-Moog that we all know about. Tell us about your version of what a Memory-Moog would be.
It was basically a programmable Minimoog, and I worked on it as a contractor. I wasn't working directly as an employee at the time, but I was working on it as a contractor, and basically had it developed to the point that we're starting to lay out circuit boards and order parts to put it in production. This is 1979, and it was decided to go ahead and upgrade the polyphonic synthesizer and put the Minimoog as I designed it on the shelf. At which time I quit the company forever. I was very upset about the whole thing, and was the proof. And I delivered a fully functioning prototype with everything working, all hand built, and said, whatever you don't mess with it. Just keep that function, which when they finally put the Memory-Moog in production, they did not do. So the Memory-Moog that hit the streets was quite a bit different than the one I delivered in 79.
So somebody had asked us about a further Minimoog development, and that would be it basically, is a Minimoog idea, monophonic with memory, with presets that could be stored. Is what's your intention?
Yeah, it eventually proved itself as a very proper concept, because basically what I had designed in 79 showed up in the world as the Moog Voyager in 2002.
Yep. And even the Memory-Moog from the 80s used the basic architecture of a expanded polyphonic Minimoog with preset options, although it's still different, of course, but it was the conceptual basis of what the Memory-Moog in the 80s came about to be. But now the reason we're here today is post all of this, Moog music as we know it was done, and Bob Moog, Tom Ray, and yourself were in different corners of the world doing different things. And then a new project came about from the Italian company called Crumar. Can you tell us how that started, how you learned about it?
Moog got a contract to develop a synthesizer for Crumar, and what it was basically was you know, a monophonic synthesizer in the mold of the Minimoog, to be produced by Crumar, which is based in Italy. And then Moog had subcontracted to myself and Tom Ray, for the three of us, to work on the project. But Robert Moog had the contract from Crumar to provide design for an instrument that a monophonic Minimoog type instrument. And so
I like that
I did a lot of the.
He decided to put together a dream team with you and Tom and himself. So what was the division of labor there? How did you guys approach this project together?
Tom chipped in with a lot of musical ideas. It should have this. No, it shouldn't work that way. No, you should put those controls over there. No, we don't need that, kind of stuff. Including some nitty-gritty details on exactly how the keyboard worked. And and he was full of ideas. He kept, rewriting lots of schedules of control panels of how the control should be arranged and so forth. Bob actually would be doing the production engineering, and what I was doing is I was designing circuits in my home, and then providing him with the designs, and then Bob would try them out at his facility. And so
you're mentioning Bob's facility. Our next slide is the actual home. Bob was moved down to North Carolina, and outside of Asheville, the pretty well-known city, is a beautiful wooded area called Big Briar Cove. So Bob had even started a side company called Big Briar Electronics, and this is their home that they custom built. And the next slide shows his workshop, which is right next door to that beautiful home. We'll show the next slide of the workshop. It's not very fancy, but it's where he did many years of design. And
he's still doing a lot of custom work.
Yep. You are up in New York still, and Tom is in Nashville, and Bob's in North Carolina.
That's right, and that's the way we worked when we designed the Spirit.
Are we talking phone calls, letters? What was your best way to communicate?
Well, we got together for a 3-person meeting to kick it off in March of '81, and then I don't think three of us met together again in person after that. Tom critiqued and suggested and so forth a lot from his location in Massachusetts, and I was in a small town right next to Trumansburg, working upstairs in a house, and had a workshop up there designing the circuitry. And and I have a slide in prototype.
The paperwork Michelle sent is a great slide coming up next, which is a comparison. It looks like a drawing of, these are the competition out there: the Moog Prodigy, the ARP Solus, the CAT, the Pro One, the Korg MS-20, and the Roland SH2 were the competitors. So there's a price point for each one, type of oscillator options, type of filter. And this is what the game was to enter the market for those Italians to try to beat them at their game of synthesizer design. And I think the Spirit is very successful at exceeding what these instruments were capable of. Tom has often discussed how you and he have this great concept of designing from the outside in. Can you tell us what that means?
I always worked from what the control panel looks like to the musician first, to define the function, and then worry more about with an eye of knowing what kind of circuitry, an idea of what kind of circuitry around to do these things practical. But my first step was, control panels and block diagrams, and then working toward the detailed circuit design to make it do it. And as you go along and do that, then refinements keep popping up. I'm not familiar. I had never seen that comparison of the Prodigy, the Solus, the SRM. I don't even know what that is.
It looks like Bob's handwriting for sure.
Okay.
But it's probably just an awareness chart. Did they have a ring mod? Did they have sample and hold? Things like that, just to be aware of what was out there. And it's a very good way to work, I would think. The next slide is a letter from Tom. He's got his logo at the top, and it's written to both of you, but I love that it's addressed. It says, "Dear Jim Bob." Tom has a great sense of humor, and it's always present in the things he does. So he's talking about the panel configuration, and Tom is again working from the outside. What is the musician going to experience? What is the interface that makes it a good instrument for them? It doesn't matter really what the capabilities are inside if no one can understand it or work it. That's a real challenge. So that page is a very telling thing that's Tom's focus in a lot of ways.
What happened was I delivered a fully functioning prototype to Bob Moog with a filter configuration different than what went into production. So we did a lot of work on that filter. We Tom and Bob and I went back and forth about its function and so forth. And finally, I delivered an instrument in September of '81. It was kind of into my design phase. I was still on the project, but I was backing off from getting it into production. And then Tom and Bob then reconfigured the filter. So the filter as it went into production was unfamiliar to me. The circuitry I had designed, but it had been the circuitry had been repurposed and the panel had been changed. And so I wrote a circuit description, which I still have, of the finished machine. But in that circuit description is actually, when I read it a few years ago, when the Crumar Spirit was being put back into production, that was an error. My actual circuit description that I had provided for the instrument was wrong. And I spent a couple of weeks trying to figure out how a circuit that I had largely designed worked. It was difficult. And I finally came up with a block diagram of the filter that actually explains if there were errors in the manual because the manual was it was written for was incomplete because Crumar took out part of the pages, didn't publish them, and also the filter section was oversimplified in the manual as written. So I provided recently. I provided the Crumar the block diagram and a description that goes on at some length on how that filter works. Because Bob made it quite a bit more capable and more complicated than what I had come up with.
I do think that's one of the hallmarks of this instrument that sets it head and tails above those other things. We're mentioning on the page there from Tom, it says of interest is the filter section. Both its spatial location and its graphics indicate that filtering is important on this instrument. It's really a significant thing, and I found that that is one of the most critical things, as well as the modulation, which we'll get into soon. On the very next slide, we have more pieces coming up. These are from a front panel drawing. Again, we talked about looking at the outside of things. And so we can see a preliminary idea put together by Tom about how this instrument will look. And again, the groupings and graphics, trying to make it more simple for a musician to understand what they're seeing and what they're doing. It's a good way to work, actually. And then you design circuits to try to match those functions and see how they work. The next slide is a notebook entry. And you're running into some ideas that you're going to create those circuits. and then try it out. That's in May of 81. And you guys are doing this,
Yeah,
what we call, yep,
go ahead.
snail mail, as we call it
As I
nowadays, but postal service mail was how you guys were communicating on all these things.
As I got a circuit working, I would get it prototype and get it working, send a schematic to Bob and a letter, and then I think he was duplicating all these and trying them himself once I worked out the bugs to make sure he had a functioning circuit to work with as he built a prototype. So I built a prototype and delivered it, but I think Bob also built a prototype, but I'm not quite sure. Now that's been a question. Exactly how
It's
many
nice that we
prototypes
have
were
these
built.
artifacts, and I will thank our lucky stars that we were stuck in those days, as modern as they were. You're using postal service, and we have physical copies of not only your correspondence, but you have a set of notebooks that still exist to this day of so many of your projects. So I love that we have hard documentation. It helps all of our memories. As you said, you're looking back over your own written words and trying to figure out what you meant by it. So it's fascinating to see. The next slide has another letter between you two, and there's a nice set of many pages of correspondence on this project.
I don't think the letters in response from Moog to me have survived. I don't have copies of them in any case.
Nope, not everything. And in fact, we'd be lucky to find 100% survival rate. But in these days, just seeing things like you were originally calling this project, everybody called it the small synth. That was the name of the Crumar project. We are designing the small synth.
We call it the little synth or the small synth, yeah, alternatively.
And I can see these are listing what you said here are the new circuit, untested circuit designs. Things for Bob to look at. And then the next slide, we've got some bug working out. You're finding some faults with things, which I find it kind of interesting. Number one is the VCO works well, so there's no issues there. You're doing fine with it. But then on part two, you're talking about sync between oscillators. And you found that conventional sync is the one you should go with. Are these things that you're just listening to on a bench and you've got two oscillators grinding against each other?
Yeah, I would be building up the synthesizer as I went along. So and listening to the stuff, trying to play it and see what the heck happens. And as you design things, unexpected things pop out that you didn't expect when you know, there's a specification, I want something such that do so and so. And you decide to do that, and you find out it does other things you may have liked, or may be a real problem that you don't really discover some of your mistakes. You can make mistakes like just simple circuit design mistakes too. All those kind of things happen.
I'm noting on the section 3 of that next page, you're talking about the response of the voltage controlled pulse width. It's that same page before, Tim. We'll go back one. There we go. This is an innovation that some other instruments could have had, but not common on little portable synthesizers. A CV controlled pulse width was a thing, and you put the additional components are worth it. So you're still thinking about cost, even though some of the parts needed might not be very expensive. You can't just put everything in the world on this machine.
Yeah, Crumar is building to a price. Once it's designed to a price, they're looking for a low cost instrument. So we're trying to keep the costs down.
And on section 4, I see one that says the VCO output must be buffered to prevent phase locking. Let's discuss the concept of phase locking, which is very interesting on these analog instruments.
Yeah, often you want oscillators to run very independently so that one does not affect the other. So phase locking is where, for example, you got two oscillators tuned to the same, very nearly the same pitch, but one is never perfect in the ideal world, and one is very slightly sharp or flat compared to the other. It causes kind of a rolling sound. The phase locking is when two oscillators are, how do you say this? The two oscillators are beating against one another, but at some point they suddenly grab onto one another and both, and we're talking on time scale of like seconds or fractions of a second. The two oscillators will be totally independent, so there'll be, and then all of a sudden one will catch the other, and both will be perfectly in tune with one another, which sounds like a single oscillator, and then they pop apart again and start moving independently. And we're talking, a cycle, off tune by a cycle a second, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that is generally something you don't want in synthesizers. It turns out it messes up the sound. One of the strong points of the Minimoog was the oscillators did not lock to one another. It was a feature that people didn't recognize directly. And so we're very careful about making sure the oscillators don't see one another some way by some sneak path in the circuitry through the power supply wires or something, so that they will momentarily lock onto one another and then let go again. Again, like on the time scale of seconds or fractions of a second.
Yes, and it's fascinating because using these documentation things, we can discuss something that you probably we weren't thinking about that in regard to the design of this, but it was a known factor in whether a synthesizer sounds fat or thin. And it's, you would think two oscillators running on their own would not do this, but it does have a function where it does happen and it's detrimental to the sound. I'm going to jump ahead on section 6 because this is a whole can of worms we're going to open up. Same page, section 6. And the trigger bounce problems have shown up. So we're about to talk about something called triggering. And that's as I said, a can of worms, but it's fascinating because there's a lot of input from Tom and there's a lot of musical electronic history on how keyboards trigger from a synthesizer. Can you get into that for a minute? Yeah,
the trigger bounce is actually the mechanical contacts of the keyboard, making and breaking on a very fast time scale. And it dirties up the sound, or causes repeat triggering and causes a nerve. So you don't want, when you press a key, you want to get a single trigger out of it, not several in rapid succession, which has on the scale of fractions of a second. Well, it's
literally a physical
triggered.
Yeah, literally a physical problem from the switch touching and closing very rapidly, almost instantaneously, but not quite, causes multiple triggers where the envelope would restart, for example. And in older keyboards, you had these very simple contact sets. Can you talk about the triggering on things like the Minimoog versus a Micromoog?
The Minimoog used a keyboard that had two bus bars, one for pitch and the other for triggering. So there's two. When you press the key, there are two mechanical contacts. One, whereas in Micromoog, it used only a single bus bar and used an electronic means to determine that a pitch, the key had been struck and the pitch had changed.
Are you floating an AC signal across that wire? Is that how it determines?
Yeah. There's the DC component of the keyboard voltage is controlling the pitch, and there's an AC portion that's supposed to be out of the picture, or audio goes, that alerts the circuitry that a trigger has been initiated. Yeah, so it's both an AC and a DC. Tom
and August Worley, our friend and also former Moog engineer, had pointed out that the Micromoog, the Multimoog, and the Taurus all use this single wire bus, which is a cost saver, and it's smart engineering to make it work as a trigger plus a pitch signal on one wire.
Tom Rank claims that actually that also muddies up the sound a little bit. Then the Micromoog sounds cleaner if you play it from an external keyboard with a separate pitch bar and trigger bar. That's what
Interesting.
Tom told me. So
Wow.
somehow putting that audio signal on the keyboard is supposed to be filtered out and not there affects the sound. That's what I have been told.
I believe it. And Tom knows a lot about these things. On the next page, our next slide is about a concept called bumble fingers. And I love the term, but you can explain. Tom is looking at the musician side of things, and triggering of a keyboard as a player would play it can produce different effects depending on how your priority of the keys are set up and how the triggering is set for the filters. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the original Moog synthesizers from 1965, or simply, I forgot where I was going with this.
Well, it's like
a
single
trigger,
versus
yeah.
multiple triggering.
Yeah, we're single triggering. You press the key and got a trigger and a gate for this, or if you want to call it that, for controlling a contour generator. And then you didn't get a new trigger until you took your hand completely off the keyboard and pressed a new key. That's just single trigger. But the later instruments used a multiple triggering, or had the option for multiple triggering, where what the note that sounded was the last note you played. So if you got many keys in front of you, and if you have a monophonic instrument, it only plays one note. So as you put one finger down, and then the next, and the next in some sequence, what note actually sounds is the question. And the solution to that is the last key you hit is the one that determines pitch. So if I hit a lower note, then an upper note, then I hit the one in between, I got still holding all the keys down. The one in the middle controls pitch, or whichever key last was depressed determines the pitch. So that's a multiple triggering machine. But the problem is, in all previous machines up to date of this design, if you had a keyboard that worked like that, the problem was that if you bump the key, that is, you're not playing cleanly. I hit a low note, high note, one in the middle, then I bump a key next to the middle note, right? The pitch will jump at previous machines to the one you bumped, bumble fingers, and so I'm holding down three keys. The one in the center should be sounding, but actually the one that I bumped is controlling the pitch that I no longer got my finger on. So we went round and round in circles on that circuitry. Tom defined how it worked, and it's up to me to try to figure out circuitry that would meet that requirement, which we finally got to work right. And Tom considered that in advance on any keyboard that in existence as of 1981.
We should point out too that there's circuitry involved here, very different than the Minimoog, which is called a scanning keyboard.
Oh yeah, this is not a bus bar type machine where a contact hits a bus bar to determine the pitch. It's actually a digital type. The keyboard is on a matrix, and the matrix feeds the logic, and the logic figures out which key you're pressing.
But the nice part about that, sort of what you mentioned before, is that you can have multiple keys held down, and let's say you're trilling between them, or if you even have, 3 notes down and you lift the high or low fingers, it can jump to whatever the last key was placed before that. There's a lot of musical opportunities there, but I also want to point out that this makes possible an arpeggiator.
Yeah, and I've forgotten a lot about how the arpeggio works on this machine. I just totally don't remember.
But it has it, but you couldn't quite do an arpeggiator with a single bus bar, for example, a keyboard that is only looking at the nearest switch closed from the bottom or from the top, for example. There are different ways to implement it. But with a multiple keys held down, be it 3 or 6 or more, it can just jump to the next note when it's doing an arpeggiator.
Yeah.
It's good. And then on the next section, it's another page after this one. When it comes up on the screen, you'll see it. This is your circuitry that you drew out to kind of sort out that keyboard logic. So you're using this building blocks of electronics here to make sure that when the player plays the keyboard a certain way, the right output comes out to control the contour generators, the shapers, based on those triggers.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand my notes, and I don't understand them. Reading my
Well, when you're in the middle of any project, it always makes sense. When you're right in the middle of that language and that environment, it's all you're thinking about. So that does make sense too. On the next slide, I want to point out something that I find interesting. So this is more of that triggering. As I said, we were opening a can of worms and you're solving some things, but in the upper section, number 9, and the lower section, number 10, you're talking about a 64-bit shift register on the upper section. And let's talk about that too. The shift register in this analog keyboard, what it's doing.
I haven't read this note. I'll have to read it for a minute here.
Okay. It's basically debouncing the arpeggiation. So I think it's giving you a little bit of a time control that the bouncing happening when you're hitting a key. It says it's the triggering comes from the LFO, not the closures. And if you implement it right, you're making false triggering impossible, which was the goal. But the next bit is a bit easier to understand. It talks about a 3-bit counter. And again, talking about this with engineering and that simple set of instructions with 3 bits, you can actually specify 8 positions, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. And so this is one thing we're seeing.
I've totally forgotten how the circuitry works, so I don't know what to say here.
But it's also a step that we're moving into a logic type thing rather than a pure analog circuit like a Moog modular system used on most of their things. You've got a crossover into these logic circuits that are helping you create something that's a very functional musical unit. And none of the musicians will ever know what's going on inside it. But these are all the many, many small problems you have to solve. By the time it hits the stores, no one even notices an issue anymore.
Yeah, that's basically the idea.
And on the next slide is about the filters. We talked about those earlier. And I think that is a significant part. This is a basic description about it. The lower filter, which is multi-mode. Some companies already had that, such as Oberheim, and Moog modulars could do that. High pass band.
I'm not on the right slide here.
Okay. It just says filter section. But basically, it's just talking about the filters. There are separate filters in here that can be controlled independently, and that gives it a lot of voicing opportunities that other synths don't have.
There it is. It's just a note. Filter says filter section. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We're just pointing out that this synthesizer has. Yeah.
Yeah. This is before. This is my original filter, which was not used. Bob Moog redesigned it to what the after I turned the project over to Bob, he made the filter more complex and much more capable.
And beyond the filters, I think the standout of this instrument, and a bit complicated to explain, but we can attempt to do it, is the modulation section on our next slide. They're termed, the 2 modulation components are mod X, which some people would understand as more of a controller, like a traditional modulation on a synthesizer, and then the shaper Y, where you can shape the X modulation with something else. So that is
Yeah,
definitely.
I'd have to have a functioning machine in front of me and fool it to figure out what that all this means nowadays.
I agree. It is complicated, but it allows us, and there is some of this that goes on in other synthesizers nowadays, where you can have one modulation section controlling the effect of the other one. If for example, the first one was an LFO and the other one was an envelope or a wheel or something, you've got the Y section allowing you to shape the X modulation going on too. It's definitely important and interesting on this, so forth. Page 77, though, is a very interesting thing that you may know about, and I don't know if anybody else visiting this knew about this, but there's a connection on the next slide. The next slide is talking about the voltage-controlled pulse width modulation, and you wanted to send it to Curtis. And Curtis is a name that's part of your history and part of synthesizer history, but can we talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, we were apparently it's for Curtis to put in an application note or to be aware. So I was using Curtis chips in the Spirit, and then later on I went to work for Curtis for a while. That wasn't a marriage made in heaven. I wasn't the right fit for what he needed and what I could do, so I didn't work for him for very long. So this was before that. I was using Curtis chips by dealing with Curtis himself or by dealing with his application notes. So I forgot where I'm going with this.
That's okay. Just that Curtis is known now because people understand that Prophet 5s use Curtis chips for a while there. I believe he was in California, Northern California, maybe.
Los Gatos.
Okay, yeah, Los designing integrated circuits that would be very useful for synthesizer designers, filters, oscillator chips, things like that.
Those went out of production, but now there are people putting those chips back into production. So there are manufacturers, and Curtis's widow is still involved in that project, last I heard.
Yes, it's good. Now I'm going to jump to the next slide, which is your front panel of the actual completed project. At some point, this small synth, or little synth, as you sometimes called it, became called the Spirit. Do we know about that name change at all?
I think it happened after I turned everything over to Moog. And after Moog had, I don't know when that name was applied, but it may have been after Moog turned the project over to them. It would have had been done before he turned over everything to Crumar, because he had the circuit boards laid out and done in the United States. So I was later on in this project, I backed out. I didn't want to be an expensive drag on Moog's profit, if any, from doing this project. So I figured I'd turn over the rest to Bob Moog. So after I got the circuitry all designed, delivered a prototype, I was still involved, but I was not. Was not involved in developing this layout we're seeing here, which has the filter section there in the center, bottom center. That was all done after I was not involved in the filter design.
And to this point,
that is not my filter. That is what the fancier filter that Moog came up with, or perhaps Moog and Pomerade.
Yep. And now we go from a bunch of prototypes and rough designs and sketches of the front panel to this mechanically designed and able to be produced in a factory thing. Do you think Bob did much of that work on the mechanical design, or did he work with the Crumar people maybe?
Well, to do the circuit board layout, he had to have a handful of all the parts that go, the pots and switches and sliders and so forth, are all mounted on the circuit board. The circuit board layout was done by a woman named Missy Mink in Ithaca, New York. We got her to do that. So she had to have the parts at hand in order to do the board layout. and the board layout, of course, goes hand in hand with the circuit board layout goes hand in hand with this front panel, because the board has to fit behind the front panel. So
I want to ask about something
all that work would have had to have been done in the United States, and Moog would have had to have delivered a functioning machine to Crumar with Spirit written on it.
Yeah.
It would seem to me.
As a designer, and I want to ask you about this because no one ever talks about the least sexy part of these designs, but it's absolutely core, is a thing called the power supply. Every electronic circuit runs on power, and specifically analog voltage controlled instruments are critical with power. Going from the Minimoog to the Micromoog to the Multimoog, etc. How do you guys choose a power supply? Do you specify your own and build it? Or do you want to use an existing design and modify it, or just buy something off the shelf? What are the considerations there for power supplies?
Well, the early instruments had built-in supplies. So the Minimoog, for example, used 10-volt supplies, plus or minus 10 volts, because the transistors we had in stock at the time wouldn't handle this more standard 15 plus or minus 15 volts. So we dropped the voltage down to 10 volts on the Minimoog, plus or minus 10 volts, so that we wouldn't burn out transistors. Then later on, the whole world went to plus or minus 15 volts. So we designed our own power supplies. I think any instrument I know, the power supply was designed as part of the instrument, except for instruments that are designed to be with a power adapter that plugs into the wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
The external supply. But I don't. Those instruments came around after I was no longer involved in synthesizer design. I think every synthesizer I was familiar with, as of the early '80s, was always had a power supply that was designed as part of the instrument.
Thanks for covering that, because it's never discussed, but it is critical. And of course, the power supplies you designed had to be quite stable, as we know that affected the rest of the instrument.
The interesting thing about power supplies, the Minimoog, one of the things I said before about the strong features of the Minimoog was the oscillators did not lock. They would not, one would not grab the other and pull it along for a while, then release it to let it going back to its neutral. This is for two oscillators. They're tuned very close to unison. And after the company went to Williamsville, they decided to refine. The original power supply was designed by Bill Himsath, and at some point, probably around '72, I would guess, it was decided to modernize that power supply and replace still an internal power supply, but to change the design to use integrated circuit power supplies instead of the one Bill designed. The original Minimoog, as it came out of Trumansburg, had no integrated circuits in it whatsoever. We designed completely with discrete transistors.
Yeah.
So they made a decision in Williamsville to replace the power supply board with a new one with a more modern voltage regulator. And lo and behold, the oscillators locked.
Yeah.
And they had to put the original design back in, because apparently the original design, the power mains, the plus or minus 10 volts, did not carry any crosstalk between the oscillators. And when they put the new power supply in, the power supply distribution would carry the crosstalk and cause the oscillators to lock. So they had to go back and use Himsath. Himsath now had been telling the world that I made that change, but in fact it happened when that Jim Scott put the new power supply in and it didn't work. They had to go back to the old. Not true. I wasn't even in the company. I was not even working for the company at the time. But anyway.
The next few slides show the finished product of the Crumar Spirit, and then there was a reissue of it about a year ago. The company had realized that the limited success of this, and we should talk about that, but it was not that successful compared to previous units. Do you think that was because of the time it came out or the Italian distribution? Do we have any ideas?
You're talking about 1982?
Yeah, the original Spirit launch.
It is a time when synthesizers like the Minimoog, one note at a time modified synthesizers, are out of vogue, first of all. I think you or somebody told me one time you could buy a used Minimoog in the 90s for a couple $100.
That's true.
So, so that was the problem. The Crumar, I don't think was very. I don't know about the distribution, but I doubt it was very good. And so they just hit the market when the market didn't want a machine like this. And Crumar had a reputation for equipment that wasn't as used cheap components and it wasn't as reliable as one would hope. So that probably, and in fact, the Crumar Spirit, as originally designed and built, used a number of cheap parts that detracted from its performance. And when the new Spirit was put into production, they've had, I think, a production run of 100. It's a kind of a museum historical project of putting this thing back into production for limited production. They replaced a lot of the cruddy slide pots and they replaced the cruddy keyboard and that kind of stuff with high quality.
Yeah, they did some improvements in a way. The slide pots were definitely a design issue on their original production that they made. Probably not in the designs you made, but their production of it. And then it's just a nice compliment. Not only the Minimoog coming back as a reissue, but this instrument too. It just shows the quality of and I mean that in a teamwork way, but specifically you two, quality of design that a classic instrument like a Hammond organ, Fender Rhodes, Fender Stratocaster, they're still valid instruments for today. And I think that's a wonderful compliment to you and your design people that it is still applicable for making today's music. I love it. Since we're on the Bob Moog Foundation broadcast, I would love to ask a little bit more about Bob because you had a good life working with him and some very important projects came out of both of you. Can you describe him just as a person, maybe for those that didn't know him or get to spend time?
He was a very good person to work for. He expected you to know what you're doing, and he would give you a project and I say, well, how am I supposed to go about that? And he says, you got to go figure that one out. But he was also very good at helping with problems. But he was good to work for because he was very tolerant of letting people. If he had an employee who basically knew what they were doing, he wasn't at all critical if he screwed up and had to redo something, which happens once in a while.
I think that only a chef can fairly critique another chef, and only a race car driver can fairly critique another race car driver. But what were the hallmarks of what Bob Moog designed? The things you saw from him as his own creation, what were his feature sets, if you will?
Well, he could come up with some very clever designs, and he was very careful to get things that design things that would work right. He designed the original oscillator for the Minimoog, which put out of production right away because it wasn't stable. It turns out years and years and years later, like 40, 30, that there was really nothing all that bad about that oscillator. It was basically a problem of using improper components in the manufacture of that original Trumansburg Minimoog. That oscillator from 1970 is now in production. Back in production is part of the Minimoog, the modular version of the Minimoog that AJ Synth is putting out. AJ,
can we jump to the next slide? Because the next slide shows you nowadays at your workbench. Oh, a slide after the Spirit slides. There's a picture of Jim working.
Yeah.
And I believe at that moment, you're looking at the Behringer design, which is a little replica of the basic circuits of the Minimoog Model D. And so there's Jim
So
at a
yes, the mini
workbench.
Moog.
Yeah. And so you
It's
are,
mini Moog. Yeah.
I love that you're
Go
fully
ahead.
still here investigating, what, 60 years ago, something like that, 50 plus, the
55.
circuits that people are
Yeah.
still making and remaking, and you're testing them and comparing them and learning about your own history too, and really looking back on it to understand those things. And the last picture, which I really love to see, came from EMIAP, and it's a guy named Dave Borden we mentioned earlier. Fantastic musician, great friend of ours. And you guys reunited at the EMIAP keyboard archive there in Harleysville, Pennsylvania, in the Minimoog section. I love that.
Yeah, you got a Minimoog A, B, C, and D stacked up behind Dave Borden there.
And so many other things. I see the XY controllers and things like that. It's a fantastic collection. If anybody gets a chance, check them out. Last bit, and I want to spend maybe a minute and a half on it, but I just want you to mention why you're way up in Talkeetna, Alaska. That's just an interesting part of your life. That could you mention it for 1 minute? Why you went to such a northern climate?
Yeah, it was to try to set up a refuge for my family in case of a climate change disaster. It looked like possibly the mid-latitudes breadbasket of the planet was going to dry up sometime in the future. And so it was to establish a habitat for the family. That has not worked out, and we just sold it. The whole works here this year.
But as you explained it to me, and I understand what you're saying is you're a scientist, you're an engineer, you've been studying this since the 70s when we called it ecology back in those days. But, you know, earth sciences and the things are warming up, whatever people think about that. And you're looking to the future, like 50 years or more, that maybe people will not be able to live at the equator areas too much, and that the entire population might be moving to Russia and northern Canada and Alaska in order to stay alive, which is shocking, but also something to keep in mind for the future. But
anyway, that whole attempt to set up a habitat in the long run turned out to be a failure, so we sold out, and I'm leaving the state here in a month or so.
Understood. It's a fascinating part of your life, though, and I think that's good. Michelle has told me, which is pretty cool, today listening to us, people from Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Canada, even France and Tahiti are following us on the stream today. So hello to everybody worldwide. It is so cool that you're turning into this. Jim is a wonderful resource. He's always involved in projects and helping people nowadays with designs, new and old. And he's been interviewed for these great books like the Minimoog book, which I love too. So I'm not going to forget to mention our sponsors, the Bob Moog Foundation, have put this together. They do such good work, and they have the Moogseum, but Asheville was hit so hard this year, we cannot forget it. And they're still recovering because of the challenges to that town. They could still use your help. If you think about instrument donations, document donations, recordings, sound, and of course, financial support is very, very important. So if you can give a few bucks or a lot of bucks or donate something in your will to them, it's going to be very helpful for the future. And then we can do more and more of these. So we've had a good run, nearly 2 hours, which is a good long time to talk. And we barely scratched the surface on some of the world's most important instruments, but it's certainly been great to do. And I love, as you can tell, talking to Jim, he's a wealth of knowledge and good memory on things, given that it's so long. So I want to thank you, Jim. Thanks to Michelle and to Tim, who's putting it on. And I will hopefully do more with you all in the future, too. Gonna say good night.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for all of you folks for letting me mouth out for a while.
Always welcome. We'll do more.